Welcome back. Today, I want to tell you a story that perhaps somewhere inside you, you've also walked through before. A story about a young man, full of excitement, full of dreams, but with each passing year, he felt himself becoming heavier. Not heavier because of age, but because of what he carried in his wallet and in his mind. He started out, like many of us, a stable job, a decent salary, and a desire to live like an adult. His first motorbike, bought on installment, a new phone, paid with a credit card, an expensive set of furniture for his tiny rented room, because I deserve it. You know that feeling of excitement during the first few hours that turns into months of financial breathlessness? The day he signed his fourth debt, the bank employee smiled brightly, but he didn't, because he wasn't buying an item, he was buying a chain, and he brought it home, placing it around his own neck. I once asked him, "Why do you keep borrowing to buy things you don't truly need?" He stayed silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because I don't want to fall behind. Everyone has it, so I wanted to." You see, sometimes we don't borrow to own something. We borrow to fill a void inside ourselves. And the most painful part isn't the debt. The most painful part is that each year passes and we remain stuck while interest rates never stay still. Today, I want to take you deeper into that story, because there are things that, had you known earlier, you wouldn't have had to pay such a high price. Are you ready? Let's begin. When I look at that young man's life, what troubles me isn't the things he bought or the amount he owed. What troubles me the most is the reason he began walking down that path. Because you see, debt never appears suddenly. It doesn't knock. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply slips into someone's life, little by little, through very small, harmless decisions, until one day they open their eyes and realize they're living in a room with no windows. I remember one evening he sat in front of me, his eyes tired. He told me that on the day he bought his first motorbike on installment, he felt a little more grown. The day he bought a phone with a credit card, he felt a little more equal to others. And the day he bought that expensive furniture, he thought he had turned a new page, becoming more mature. But each time, he traded away a piece of his freedom without even noticing. That is the root of the problem. We often don't see debt as debt. We see it as a shortcut to feeling validated. Many people don't truly want the item they buy. They want the feeling it promises, feeling fuller, more beautiful, more successful, or at least not inferior to anyone. But you and I both know the truth. That feeling lasts only a few hours. But the debt lasts for years. I'm not saying this to blame anyone, because even I, in my younger years, once stood in a store staring at something I couldn't afford and asked myself, if I don't buy it now, will I fall behind? A naive question, yet one that pushes countless people into decisions they later pay double for. The real problem is not the item. The real problem is that we want to use future money to patch the emptiness of the present. Think about it. Why would an ordinary young man willingly sign a contract he knows he'll have to pay for 3 years? Why would a young woman swipe her card for an expensive bag only to struggle through the end of the month? It's not because they're foolish. It's not because they lack knowledge. It's because they carry a fear, the fear of not being enough, the fear of being left behind, the fear of not being seen. That fear is what makes people trade away the most. It leads us into traps we don't realize we've stepped into. I once told someone, you don't need that item right now. What you really need is time. He looked at me, silent, because no one had ever said that to him. Time that is the real asset. Time to learn a skill. Time to build a financial foundation. Time to change your life from the inside. But when we're in debt, time is no longer ours. It belongs to the lender. Debt forces us to work, not to move forward, but to return to where we started. It's like walking uphill. Every step you take, gravity pulls you back a bit. The harder you push, the more exhausted you become. The more exhausted you are, the easier it is to give up. And then you sit down, wondering why you can't get ahead even though you tried so hard. But here's the truth. It's not that your effort is weak. It's that the burden you carry is too heavy. Do you know what's heartbreaking? Many people don't realize they're living on future money until the future knocks on their door and demands everything back with interest. And by then, that 1 hour of comfort becomes years of burden. I asked the young man, if you didn't buy those things, what would happen? He answered, "Probably nothing." I nodded. "Exactly. But if you can't pay your debt, everything will happen." That is the paradox. We fear feeling deprived for a few days, yet accept feeling heavy for many years. The root of the problem was never money. Money is just the surface. The root lies in not knowing how to distinguish between real ownership and temporary ownership. Real ownership brings freedom. Temporary ownership brings illusion. And illusions, as you know, always come with a price. One evening, that young man and I sat in a small roadside cafe. The sound of traffic outside blended with the scent of roasted coffee, making us feel as though we had slipped into a rare pause amid the chaos of life. He placed his wallet on the table, opened it, and looked at the papers inside as if he were looking into a wordless diary. I saw a few receipts, 2 credit cards, an installment contract, and a slip of paper with the bank employee's phone number on it. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone relieved. It was the smile of someone who had grown so used to heaviness that he mistook it for a natural part of life. "You know, teacher," he said, his voice so soft I had to lean closer to hear, "the day I bought my first motorbike, it felt like I had stepped up a new rung on the ladder. I rode it around the city all night. I felt freer." I took a sip of coffee and asked, "So how long did that feeling last?" He didn't need much time to think. Maybe a few days. After that, only the monthly payments were left. Then he continued, as if every word was a piece of memory being pulled out from an old drawer. His girlfriend had called his phone too old, so he immediately bought a new one. A coworker showed off an expensive speaker system, so he bought a similar one. His friends checked in at fancy places, so he rushed into parties beyond his means. All of it just to prove he wasn't less than anyone else. But in the end, when everyone went home after those parties, he was the only one who stayed awake, worrying about how to pay the bills at the end of the month. He told me, "I don't understand why my life keeps running in circles like this. I work hard, but I never feel like I'm moving forward." I looked at him for a long time, not to find an answer, but to listen to that faint cry many of us have heard inside ourselves, the cry of someone trying to swim against the current while a stone is tied to their feet. After a moment, he sighed. "You know what the worst feeling is? It's not being short on money. It's feeling like I can't control my own life." I nodded, because I understood. It is the feeling of someone who has become accustomed to chasing what others expect and forgotten what they truly need. "There was a time," he said, "I was at the supermarket and saw a small family shopping. They chose each item carefully, considering every price. They didn't buy what they didn't need, but they laughed a lot. I stood there, watching them, and I felt poor." Teacher. Not poor in money, poor in peace. That was the first time he clearly saw the truth. Debt doesn't just take someone's money, it also takes their mental tranquility. He began to realize something he hadn't understood for many years. Every time he signed a loan, he wasn't just buying a product. He was buying more sleepless nights. He was buying another month of working to pay for things he no longer enjoyed. He was buying more distance between himself and the future he dreamed of. At one point, his voice cracked. "You know, there are mornings when I wake up not because I want to work, but because I'm afraid I won't have the money for the payments. I live out of fear, not out of dreams." That sentence hit me deeply, because I have met countless people like him, people who aren't lacking in ability or willpower, but whose lives are squeezed small by impulsive decisions made in minutes and paid for over years. I asked him, "What made you change?" He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he answered, "It was the day I looked at my debt notebook and realized I had spent 8 years buying feelings that lasted only a few days." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "And what did you do then?" He lifted his head, his eyes carrying a hint of brightness for the first time. "I decided to stop buying feelings. I decided to start buying freedom." We sat there for a long while, saying nothing, because sometimes silence speaks the clearest. It says that life doesn't change just because we earn more money. It changes when we learn to see what is truly taking our freedom away. And for that young man, the journey of transformation didn't begin with a large sum of money, but with a very small question: am I owning my life or renting it with debt? After that conversation, I returned to my room and sat quietly for a long time. I thought about his words. I spent 8 years buying feelings that lasted only a few days. If you listen to that slowly, you'll feel it opening a doorway into a deeper layer of life. A layer very few people dare to look at, Because somewhere along this journey, many of us have forgotten an old truth. Freedom isn't something you gain by adding more, it's something you reclaim by removing. There is a saying I once heard from my teacher. It's not what you own that shapes your life, it's what you're obligated to pay for. It sounds simple, but when you reflect it onto the lives of those in debt, you'll see it cuts like a thin blade. Because debt is not just an amount of money, it is an instruction, a schedule you cannot refuse. A collector standing at your door each month saying, "It's time to pay." The insight lies here. Debt doesn't begin with money. Debt begins with a mistaken belief. The belief that you must have something right now. The belief that happiness can be bought quickly. The belief that validation has a price. The belief that feeling enough is something you can pay off in installments. But there is something many people don't realize. Happiness never comes after a transaction. It comes after a journey. A journey you walk by your own effort, not by using someone else's money. When I observe the lives of many young people, I see an image. They are like runners on a beautiful road. But instead of running lightly and steadily, they choose to tie sandbags to their legs. Each debt is one sandbag, and then they wonder why they're exhausted, why others move further ahead, why every step feels like dragging a mountain behind them. The paradox is this. They don't realize they were the ones who tied those sandbags to their own legs. I once asked someone, "Why did you borrow money to buy that?" He said, "Because if I didn't, I'd feel like I wasn't as good as others." I replied, "But are you even equal to yourself?" That was the moment he stopped, because he realized something he had never faced before. Many debts are created not to meet a need, but to soothe an emptiness. And here is the second insight, sharp as cold metal. Debt injures a person's sense of dignity more than their wallet. Because each month when you pay it, you're not paying only with money. You're paying with the extra hours you work. You're paying with the opportunities you must forfeit. You're paying with the freedom you should have had. And sometimes you pay with your very dreams. I once met a man who postponed his dream of starting a business for 4 years simply because he had to pay off debts for things he didn't even own anymore. Some items had broken, some had become outdated, some he no longer liked, but the bills still arrived regularly, as if to remind him that his freedom was being held by someone else. Debt has a very strange nature. It gives you the feeling of moving forward for one day, only to pull you backward for many years. It's like borrowing a flash of bright light for a few minutes, but then having to live in a long stretch of darkness. And when that light goes out, you realize you've been facing the wrong direction for a very long time without knowing it. The third insight, the most important one, is this. People only truly begin to change when they see the cost of not changing. That young man didn't change because the debt was too big. He changed because one morning he looked in the mirror and realized he had lost 8 years, not 8 years of work, but 8 years of freedom. And freedom, once lost, is not easy to reclaim. Freedom doesn't disappear in a single day. It disappears in small decisions. A phone, a piece of furniture, an expensive meal beyond your income, an illusion that just this once is harmless. But just this once is the opening line of many lives that spiral downward. The final insight, one of the strongest truths I've ever seen in people. Poor people often buy things that make them look rich. Rich people buy things that make them truly rich. Not rich in money, rich in choices, rich in time, rich in freedom, rich in the ability to say no to what's unnecessary, rich in the strength not to trade their future for a moment in the present. And you will see this most clearly when you face the last debt of your life. Because in that moment, you won't just be paying off an amount of money. You will be returning yourself with all the dignity, autonomy, and peace you lost along the way. When we talk about money, many people think change begins with a big number, a savings amount, an investment, a new level of income. But that's not the truth. A person's life doesn't change in grand moments. It changes in small things, quiet things, things only they themselves know. I remember there was a time that young man said he didn't know where to start. He looked at his list of debts and felt like he was staring up at the peak of a mountain that was too high, so high that he didn't know if he could ever climb it. I told him, no one climbs a mountain by staring at the summit. People climb it by placing their foot on the first step. And that first step is always smaller than you think. I told him to do something very simple. In the evening, before going to bed, sit down for 5 minutes and write out 3 questions. Just 3. Does this item feed me? Does it make my future easier each day or harder? If my income stopped for 6 months, would I still keep it? At first he laughed, thinking it was a joke. But a week later, he called me. He said, "Teacher, for the past 7 days, for the first time in my life, I didn't buy anything that I later regretted." I asked, "Was it hard?" He replied, "The hardest part was answering honestly. But once I could answer, the decision became unexpectedly easy." Practical application often begins just like that, with honesty toward yourself. Because many people don't fall into debt because they can't do the math. They fall into debt because they don't dare tell themselves the truth about why they're buying something. One person buys a new phone because the old one is slow. But the truth is, they're afraid their friends will think they're behind. Another person buys expensive clothes because it's needed for work. But the truth is, they want the feeling of confidence they haven't built from within yet. When you start to look deeper into the real reasons, you'll see something. People don't buy things. People buy emotions. And when the emotion fades, only the bill remains. I often tell young people, you don't have to cut everything out. You just have to start choosing what deserves to stay. And the things that deserve to stay always share one trait. They bring you closer to freedom, not farther from it. One evening, that young man sat with me and said he wanted to regain the feeling of being in control of his life. I suggested something that sounded trivial. Every morning, send ahead 10% of the month's debt payment into the repayment account. Not to get it over with, but to remind himself that he was the one at the wheel, not someone being dragged along. A month later, his voice sounded lighter. For the first time, I feel like I'm paying off debt from a place of initiative, not from fear. I smiled. Because that's what many people don't understand. Paying off debt is not just a financial act. It's the act of rebuilding your self-respect. A person who has lost their freedom is someone who wakes up and thinks, "What do I have to pay today?" A person who is beginning to be free is someone who wakes up and thinks, "What do I choose today?" Practical application is exactly that shift from have to do to choose to do. One afternoon, we walked past an electronics store. On the shelf was a newly released laptop. Beautiful, shiny, tempting. He looked at it, then looked at me. I asked, "Do you need it?" He sighed, "No, I just want the feeling of holding it in my hands." I asked, "How long will that feeling last?" He replied, "Maybe a few days." I asked again, "And the debt?" He answered, "A few years." And for the first time, he walked out of the store without regret. That was the moment he began to own his life again. Practical application doesn't mean cutting all spending, living harshly, or forcing yourself into rigid rules. No. Practical application is when you begin to ask the right questions, when you begin to realize that every dollar you spend is a vote you cast for the life you want or the life you'll regret. And when you start voting for freedom a little more each day, something strange happens. You realize you don't need as much as you used to. You don't need to keep up with anyone. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to live a life where every night when your head hits the pillow, you know you don't owe anyone anything. No money. No emotions. Not even yourself. There is something I've seen after many years of talking with people. They often think freedom is the destination. But in truth, freedom is only the reward life gives to those who know how to live with discipline. It's a beautiful paradox. We assume discipline is a shackle, but it's discipline that unlocks the doors debt has closed. My teacher once said, discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. But in today's story, discipline is also the bridge between debt and freedom. And what makes this bridge strongest is not the power of will, but awareness. Because people only fall into debt when they fall asleep in their small decisions. A rushed decision to buy something, a desire to be acknowledged, a weak moment when comparing themselves to others. All of these are very human, very real. But these very small things are what lead us down a very long road. The philosophy lies here. Each person's life is shaped not by big decisions, but by habits repeated every day. No one gets into debt because of just one purchase. People get into debt because of a way of living, and a way of living only changes when we start looking deeply into the things we used to avoid. I often tell my young students, don't let your life be decided by the moments when you're not awake, because most debts are signed when people are not awake, or worse, fully awake, but not honest with themselves. Let me share an image. Imagine your life as a field. On that field, every day you plant something in the soil. a seed of discipline, or a seed of impatience, a seed of saving, or a seed of emotional spending, a seed of long-term vision, or a seed of instant gratification. The interesting thing is the soil doesn't discriminate. Whatever you plant, it grows. Some people plant debt every month and then feel surprised when they see a field full of vines choking their own freedom. Others plant discipline, and years later they stand in a garden full of sweet fruit, not because they were luckier, but because they planted differently than you. They planted what nourishes the future, not what entertains the present. The deepest philosophy in the story of choosing ownership instead of debt is this: ownership doesn't begin with the item. Ownership begins with awareness. A person cannot own assets if they don't know how to own their mindset. A person cannot own freedom if they don't learn to own their choices. A person cannot own their life if they spend most of their time running from the consequences they themselves created. Freedom is not when you have no more debt. Freedom is when you no longer need to buy emotions with money that doesn't belong to you. I remember an older man once told me, "Jim, it took me 20 years to understand freedom doesn't come from how much I have. It comes from how much I need to live fully." That sentence made me pause for a long time, because he wasn't talking about wealth. He was talking about enough something. Debt will never let you feel. Debt makes you always feel lacking, no matter how much you have. Another philosophy I want you to remember: debt doesn't take your money first. Debt takes your future first. You don't even get a chance to use your money for what truly matters, for your dreams, for your family, for yourself, because it's already tied to wrong decisions in the past. You are not poor because you lack money. You are poor because your future has been spent before it arrives. But the miracle of life is this: the future can be spent early, but it can also be rebuilt if you're willing to start again from the roots. That young man did it, not because he was stronger than others, not because he was richer, but because he had a moment of awakening, the moment he looked at the things that once made him proud and realized all they had left behind was a long shadow of regret. From that day on, he stopped chasing feelings. He began chasing value. He stopped asking, "What do I want right now?" He asked, "What will nourish me for many years to come?" And when the question changed, his life changed. The deepest philosophy I want to leave with you before we move to the conclusion is this: you can lose money, you can lose opportunities, you can lose a few years of your life, but never lose the ability to say, "I choose." Because once you lose that, you lose everything. When I look back at that young man's journey, a journey that began with accidental decisions, passed through heavy years, and ended in awakening, I realize there is something all of us forget. Life doesn't change in glorious moments, but in very quiet evenings when we sit facing ourselves, not running, not making excuses, simply honest enough to say, "I want to live differently." And in that quiet moment, you hear a small whisper inside you, a voice that debt, noise, and the expectations of others have buried for too long. That voice doesn't push you to become rich overnight, nor does it demand that you become someone else. It simply reminds you that you deserve a life that is lighter, freer, more peaceful. I asked that young man one afternoon years later, when he had finally paid off his last debt, "How do you feel now?" He smiled a smile with no burden attached. He said, "I feel like I've just been given back." I asked, "Given back what?" He looked into the distance and replied, "Given back myself." That answer made me fall silent for a very long time, because that is something many people never say but deeply crave. Not money, not assets, not wealth, but being given back to themselves. The freedom to choose, to live, to decide, without fear leaning over their shoulder. You know, freedom has a very special sound. It's not loud, not dazzling. It's not like the cheer when you buy your first new item, or the rush in your chest when you hold something shiny. Freedom has a very soft sound, like the deep breath you take in the morning when you wake up and don't have to count how many days until the next payment. Like your laughter when you no longer have to hide your worries. Like the light footsteps of someone who knows nothing is pulling them backward anymore. Freedom is not a grand destination. It is a state within, a steadiness, a clarity, a life no longer controlled by small but persistent things. A quietness understood only by those who have broken free from what once bound them. And you, wherever you are in your journey, can touch that quietness too. You don't need to pay off everything at once. You don't need to change your life in a single day. You only need to begin with one question. Does this bring me closer to freedom? That single question is enough to pull you away from impulsive decisions, fleeting emotions, shiny things you know will slip from your hands long before you've truly enjoyed them. It is enough to lead you toward different choices, choices with roots, depth, and a future. And if you stay faithful to that question every day, you will begin to see your life change in gentle ways. Like water that first drips, then becomes a small stream, then grows into a refreshing river, and one day you look back and realize you have stepped out of what once held you down. Before ending, I want you to pause for a moment, truly pause and ask yourself, am I owning my life or renting it through debt? That question may make you silent. It may give you a slight chill, but the questions that make us tremble are the ones that make us grow. If any part of today's message touched you, leave a below. Not for me to know you're here, but so you can mark a moment. The moment you chose to look at your life with more seriousness and more gentleness. And if you found value in these reflections, hit like and subscribe. Not to support me, but so that each time you open YouTube, you see a reminder. Don't trade the future for a temporary feeling. Before you go, I want to give you a sentence that I believe everyone should carry for life. Success is not something you chase, but something you attract by the person you become. May you become the kind of person freedom always finds.